I remember standing some distance from my colleagues in Perlman Sanctuary one afternoon in March 2020, considering the materials we would need while working from home for what we imagined would only be a few weeks. It was a long shot, we thought, but someone suggested we bring home our Passover materials, just in case. I remember a few months later when we came together to rehearse the High Holy Days, the first and only time we hoped that we would need to record services for the entire community to participate from home, rather than seated together in our large sanctuary. I remember conversations last fall with leaders of our various Tikkun Olam initiatives, especially our Feed the Homeless program and our Thanksgiving Baskets event, questioning how we could possibly continue these important community mitzvah projects when for decades we had hosted these programs with groups of volunteers gathered closely together inside. I couldn't possibly have seen it while we were actually having these conversations. But looking back on these past 19 months, I now see that while COVID-19 profoundly disrupted how synagogues like ours operate, each of these moments also offered us opportunity to expand our thinking around what we do. As Professor Herminia Ibarra explains in her recent piece for Harvard Business Review, events like the COVID-19 pandemic that disrupt our habitual routines have the potential to catalyze real change. They give us a chance to experiment with new activities and to create and to renew connections. This indeed has been true for us here at NSCI. What did all of these conversations yield, you might be thinking? Well, Dr. Goodman's smiling here. She has navigated our school over this past year and a half. Well, Passover 2020 was the first of what would come to be many opportunities to produce meaningful rituals online, serving a virtual congregation multiple times the size of any congregation, any event, any group that we have ever gathered here at NSCI before at one time. As for our multi-axis approach to the High Holy Days, not just in 2020, but again a couple weeks ago, we learned to challenge our assumptions about what worship must look and feel like. An opportunity to innovate, pushing ourselves in the where, when, and how we celebrate the new year. And those many hours over this past year and a half spent reimagining our Tikkun Olam programming resulted in new ways for individuals and families to participate in the essential work of Tikkun Olam, the repair of our world. And so in light of this week's Torah portion about the creation of the world, I'm now seeing our progress since March 2020 with new insights. Let's step back for just a moment and remember how Torah describes God's work on the first day. When God was about to create heaven and earth, the earth was chaos, unformed, and on the chaotic water's face there was darkness. Then God's Spirit glided over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And when God saw how good the light was, God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night. There was evening, and there was morning on the first day. In studying these verses this week, I was struck by two things. First, the portion teaches a valuable lesson about new beginnings. The way of the world is for chaos and darkness to precede light. Second, everything that God created was done step by step, a careful process of discovery, execution, and evaluation. The concept that from darkness we might emerge in light is especially troubling, given all that we learn, even as little children, about how we should be afraid of the dark. That isn't a new concept, as we even find way back in the Talmud that Adam and Eve were afraid of the dark too. Jewish tradition tells us the very first night Adam and Eve experienced, they spent facing each other, fasting and crying the whole night long. What if this was the end? What if the whole world had returned to the tohu vavohu that preceded creation? Chaos and darkness, the new forever state. What would a life of continual darkness be? Hour after hour, they mourned the loss of light and feared the dark. And then dawn broke. Just like that, a night of tears and terror ended with the first light breaking on the horizon. Seeing the light meet the darkness, Adam understood, and he said, "This is the way of the world." As one modern teacher explains, we can learn from this that it is the way of the world for darkness to precede light. In our lives, that means that before we will experience the light of any worthwhile accomplishment, it is normal to pass through a period of darkness and uncertainty. In fact, most of the world lives about 50% of our lives in daylight, and the other half in darkness, a natural cycle of darkness to light and darkness to light. So too, Jewish tradition reminds us that the dark periods of our lives, those times marked by great uncertainty and difficulty and concern, well, they are usually, we pray, eventually followed by periods of clarity and growth. But navigating that cycle is really hard, both physically and emotionally. But this week's Torah portion also offers us the step-by-step process to help us shape the world and to recognize the good. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory teaches about Parshat Bereshit, it tells us how to be creative, namely in 3 stages. The first is the stage of saying, "Let it be." The second is the stage, "And there was." The third, teaches Sachs, is the stage of seeing that it is good. In other words, like God, we too in our work on earth must begin with the "let there be," a period of discovery, an effort to tackle an identified problem. Second is our execution of a plan to address that problem, which is often the most difficult stage because it is far easier to ignore problems or return to familiar ways of doing things rather than to risk failing. Third, just as God stepped back after creating day and night, acknowledging ki tov, it is good, we too must devote time and energy to continually evaluate and reevaluate the work that we do. This week's portion offers for us here at NSCI, as well as for each of us personally in our own lives, a pathway for navigating the many challenges of life during the pandemic. Just as God created the world one step and one day at a time, we too have faced one challenge after another in these past 19 months, strengthened by our hopes for the light that inevitably follows darkness, a truth from the very beginning. Looking back over these past many months, it's when we were most courageous and innovative that we as a synagogue, and perhaps you too as individuals in your own lives and in your own work, were most successful, yielding new programs, new services, new opportunities, and new ways of being. As the once novel challenges we faced in the early months of the pandemic are now more and more familiar to us, a new normal, if you will, I pray that we can continue to muster the strength to live life on life's terms. May we be strengthened by the support of friends and family and the broader community in our navigating of these uncertain days, as well as by our hope that life will one day be better. We will never return to a normal of the before times, but life will go on. Each of our actions in the dark periods contributing to new life and new light. For that's the way of the world, a cycle of darkness and light, and both are opportunities for learning and for growth. Shabbat Shalom.